The stallion had already shattered 3 men's ribs and crushed a seasoned trainer's leg. He was an executioner on 4 hooves. The Duke gave the order, "Shoot the beast at dawn." But as the rifles were loaded, a whisper-quiet stable girl stepped directly into the monster's path. The splintering of thick oak echoed through the cavernous stone stables of Aylesbury Manor, followed by a scream that sent a chill through the crisp October air of 1892. Theodore Fitzroy, the 9th Duke of Aylesbury, stood perfectly still in the center of the aisle, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked beneath his trimmed beard. At 32, Theodore was a man shaped by the rigid expectations of the British peerage and the brutal discipline of his past military service in the cavalry. He did not tolerate disobedience in his men, and he certainly did not tolerate it in his animals. Yet, the creature trapped inside the reinforced foaling stall was rapidly proving to be the sole exception to his rule. Get him out. Pull him back before he turns on Davies. The Duke barked, his voice cutting through the panic. 3 burly grooms scrambled into the dust-choked stall, desperately hauling on lead ropes attached to a towering, pitch-black Andalusian thoroughbred cross. The horse, named Erebus after the Greek personification of deep darkness, reared with terrifying agility. His hooves struck the stone wall with the force of a cannon blast. In the chaos, the head groom, John Davies, dragged himself out from beneath the churning hooves, clutching a mangled shoulder, his face pale with shock. Theodore watched as the men finally managed to slam the heavy iron-wrought door shut, trapping the beast inside once more. Erebus let out a high, vibrating squeal of rage, pacing the confines of his prison like a caged tiger. He was 18 hands of pure, coiled obsidian muscle imported at great expense from a notoriously secretive breeder in Cadiz, Spain. Theodore had purchased him for a singular purpose. In exactly 1 month, the annual autumn hunt would commence, hosted by his bitter rival Lord Charles Montague. The 2 men had wagered an obscenely high stake, the deeds to a contested stretch of prime hunting woodland bordering their estates. To win, Theodore had to lead the hunt on a mount that outclassed Montague's prized champion. Erebus was supposed to be that mount. Instead, he was a demon that had systematically hospitalized half the Duke's staff since arriving at the Southampton docks 2 weeks prior. "He is unrideable, Your Grace," Davies gasped, leaning heavily against a wooden support pillar, as another stable hand bound his bleeding shoulder. "The creature is mad. He feels no pain from the whip, and the harder you pull the bit, the harder he fights. He's a killer." Theodore's slate-gray eyes narrowed. "No animal is unbreakable, Davies. We are simply using the wrong methods. Starve him for 2 days. Provide only water. Let hunger dampen his fire." As the Duke turned on his heel and strode out of the stable, his heavy riding boots clicking sharply against the cobblestones, he failed to notice the slight figure sweeping the hay near the tackroom. Josephine Bennet kept her head bowed, the brim of her worn tweed cap pulled low over her face. At 22, Josephine was a ghost in the bustling ecosystem of the Aylesbury estate. She rarely spoke, moving with a silent efficiency that made it easy for the boisterous grooms to ignore her entirely. She had secured the menial job of a stallmaker out of sheer desperation, needing the meager wages to buy medicine for her ailing younger sister. But Josephine was not merely a peasant girl with a broom. She was the only daughter of the late Dr. William Bennet, one of the most brilliant, albeit eccentric, equine behaviorists in the country before a fatal carriage accident took his life. Josephine had spent her entire childhood at her father's side, watching, learning, and absorbing a philosophy that Victorian society actively mocked, that horses were not machines to be dominated by force, but sensitive creatures that communicated through a complex, silent language of the body. When the Duke and his men departed, leaving the stable eerily quiet except for the heavy, rhythmic snorting of the stallion, Josephine set down her broom. She walked slowly toward the reinforced stall, Erebus immediately pinned his ears flat against his skull, baring his teeth as he lunged at the iron bars. Most people flinched or stepped back. Josephine did neither. She stood her ground, remaining perfectly motionless. She did not look at his eyes, a gesture of predation in the animal kingdom, but instead lowered her gaze to his chest. She noticed what the Duke and his heavy-handed grooms had missed. She saw the way Erebus favored his left hind leg slightly when he pivoted. She saw the old jagged scar tissue hidden beneath the thick black mane on the right side of his neck, suggesting he had once been brutally tied and beaten. Most importantly, she saw the sheer, unadulterated terror masking his aggression. The stallion was not inherently evil. He was a severely traumatized survivor fighting a perpetual war against a world he believed was trying to kill him. They don't understand you, do they? Josephine whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of his ragged breathing. She reached into her heavy canvas apron and pulled out a single bruised apple. She didn't offer it through the bars. She simply placed it on the ledge of the door, turned her back to the horse, and walked away to resume her sweeping. Behind her, the frantic pacing stopped. A long, cautious silence filled the barn. Then the soft crunching of the apple echoed through the aisle. It was a tiny, fragile bridge built over an ocean of fear, and Josephine knew the real test was yet to come. 3 days later, the tension at Aylesbury Manor reached a violent crescendo. Lord Charles Montague had arrived for an unannounced visit, his carriage rolling into the main courtyard with an arrogant clatter. Montague, a man who wore his immense wealth like a garish coat, had come specifically to inspect the Spanish demon he had heard rumors about in the local taverns. Theodore's pride was a raw, exposed nerve. Refusing to show weakness before his rival, the Duke ordered Erebus to be brought out into the open courtyard. It was a catastrophic mistake. The moment the stallion was dragged from the dim sanctuary of the stable into the bright, blinding sunlight of the courtyard, surrounded by the clamor of visiting carriages, yapping hounds, and shouting men, he shattered. 5 grooms clung to the heavy lunge lines attached to the horse's spiked iron halter. Erebus let out a sound that chilled the blood, a high, unnatural scream of absolute panic. He reared up, his massive frame blocking out the sun, and struck out with his front hoofs. One of the grooms shrieked as a hoof caught him glancingly in the ribs, sending him sprawling across the cobblestones. "Hold him down," Theodore roared, his face flushed with fury and embarrassment, as Montague watched from a safe distance, a smirk playing on his lips. "He's tearing my hands to shreds, Your Grace," another groom yelled, blood seeping through his thick leather gloves as the rope burned through them. Erebus violently threw his head back, snapping one of the thick lead ropes like a piece of twine. The sudden release of tension threw 2 more men off balance. The stallion was now half loose, spinning in a tight, frenzied circle, bucking with enough force to shatter stone. He was heading straight toward the Duke's prized glass greenhouse, wildly out of control. Theodore realized the situation was beyond saving. The horse was a lethal hazard. With a grim, hardened expression, the Duke unclasped the holster at his hip and drew his heavy Webley revolver. He cocked the hammer, the metallic click slicing through the chaos. "Clear the courtyard," Theodore commanded, stepping forward, leveling the gun at the horse's broad chest. "I said clear away. He's a dead loss." The remaining grooms dropped their ropes and scattered, diving behind stone walls and carriages. Erebus, feeling the sudden release of the ropes, froze for a split second, his chest heaving, sweat turning his black coat into a slick, frothing lather. Theodore tightened his finger on the trigger. "Stop." The word was not shouted, but it cut through the air with a strange, piercing clarity. From the shadows of the stable archway, Josephine stepped out into the glaring sunlight. She had discarded her tweed cap, allowing a cascade of messy chestnut hair to fall around her shoulders. She wore only her simple, coarse work dress and heavy boots. Theodore stared at her, utterly bewildered. "Are you mad, girl?" "Get out of the line of fire." Josephine ignored the Duke completely. She ignored the loaded revolver pointed in her direction. Her entire focus was locked onto the trembling, 1,200-pound beast preparing to bolt. She walked slowly but with deliberate rhythmic steps. As she moved, she did the exact opposite of what the men had done. She did not raise her arms. She did not shout. She slightly rounded her shoulders, making her posture incredibly soft and submissive. She averted her eyes, looking only at the ground near the horse's front hooves. "Gerla, I will not warn you again," Theodore shouted, stepping forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't shoot without risking hitting her, but the horse was winding up to charge. Josephine stopped 10 feet from Erebus. She took a deep breath and began to hum. It was a low, steady, resonant note, vibrating from her chest. Erebus, confused by this strange, non-threatening creature, halted his frantic spinning. His ears, previously pinned back in rage, flicked forward with hesitation. He snorted, a massive blast of air that kicked up the dust around Josephine's boots. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Josephine extended one hand. She did not reach out with her palm flat, which a horse could mistake for an impending blow, but with the back of her hand offered like a question. She took one step to the left, positioning herself entirely on the horse's left side, where she had previously noticed the jagged scar tissue. The side where his blind spot was likely caused by a previous beating to the eye. She moved into his field of safe vision. The courtyard was dead silent. Even Lord Montague had dropped his smirk, staring in stunned disbelief. Theodore's finger remained on the trigger, but the barrel of the gun slowly dipped toward the cobblestones. Erebus lowered his massive head, the whites of his eyes still showing. His nostrils flared. He extended his neck, sniffing the air around Josephine's outstretched hand. He recognized the scent. It was the scent of the quiet girl in the bar. The scent of the apple. Josephine didn't move. She allowed the horse to make the final choice. With a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to release weeks of pent-up terror, Erebus stepped forward and pressed his velvet muzzle against the back of her knuckles. A collective gasp rippled through the hidden grooms. Josephine slowly turned her hand and ran her fingers gently up the bridge of his nose, deliberately avoiding the cruel iron halter that dug into his skin. "You're not a monster," she murmured softly, a thumb finding a pressure point behind his left ear, rubbing it rhythmically. "You're just terrified." With her other hand, she reached up to the thick leather strap of the iron halter. "Stand still, my brave boy," she whispered. With a sharp click, she unbuckled the heavy iron contraption. The heavy metal spiked noseband fell to the cobblestones with a harsh clang. Erebus was now completely free. No ropes. No halter, nothing holding him to the girl but trust. Instead of bolting, the stallion let out a soft nicker. He dropped his head entirely, burying his nose into Josephine's shoulder, his eyes closing halfway. Theodore Fitzroy stood paralyzed. He slowly uncocked his revolver and slid it back into its leather holster. He had commanded regiments. He had broken wild mustangs in the colonies. He had wealth, power, and absolute authority. Yet he had just been rendered entirely powerless by a ragged stable girl who wielded nothing but silence and empathy. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots causing Erebus to tense slightly, but Josephine's steady hand kept the horse grounded. The dupe stopped a few feet away, his towering frame casting a shadow over them. He looked from the terrifying beast, now docile as a lamb, down to the young woman whose eyes finally rose to meet his. Her gaze was not fearful, nor was it defiant. It was incredibly sad, carrying a wisdom that deeply unsettled him. "Who are you?" Theodore asked, his voice stripped of its usual commanding boom, leaving only a quiet, raw curiosity. "I am Josephine, Your Grace," she replied quietly, her hand never leaving the stallion's dark coat. "And if you ever pull a gun on this animal again, I will let him trample your greenhouse to dust." The air in the Aylesbury stables shifted imperceptibly in the weeks that followed the courtyard incident. Theodore Fitzroy, a man who had commanded thousands on the battlefields of the Empire, did the unthinkable. He handed complete control of his most prized, dangerous asset to a 22-year-old stable girl. The decision scandalized the estate. Head groom John Davies handed in his resignation, citing his refusal to take orders from a madwoman who whispers to demons. Theodore accepted it without hesitation. He promoted Josephine Bennet to head of equine affairs, a title entirely unprecedented for a woman in 1892. Josephine's first official act was to banish the whips, the spiked bits, and the heavy chains. She moved Erebus to a sprawling, grassy paddock, far from the noise of the main courtyard. For the first week, she didn't even attempt to ride him. Instead, she sat in the center of the pasture with a worn, leather-bound journal, the notes of her late father, Dr. William Bennet, and his esteemed colleague, Dr. Harrison Fairchild of the Royal Veterinary College. Theodore, stripped of his pride and driven by a strange magnetic fascination, would stand by the wooden fences for hours watching her. He observed how Josephine used spatial pressure. She never chased the stallion. When Erebus paced frantically, she turned her back. When he paused and looked at her, she softened her posture, inviting him in. It was a silent, psychological dance. She was teaching the war-torn animal that humans could be a source of peace, not pain. "You are rewriting everything I was taught at Sandhurst," Theodore remarked one crisp afternoon, leaning against the fence rail as Josephine brushed the stallion's gleaming black shoulder. Erebus, once a coiled spring of lethal violence, stood with his bottom lip relaxed, eyes half-closed in pure contentment. The military teaches men to break a horse's spirit, so he has no choice but to obey, Josephine replied softly, not looking up from her work. "My father taught me to earn a horse's heart, so he wants to obey. A broken horse will abandon you when the fear of the battlefield outweighs his fear of the whip. A willing partner will walk through fire for you." Theodore stepped over the bottom rail, entering the paddock. Erebus' ears flicked back, a shadow of his old anxiety returning at the sight of the tall, broad-shouldered man. Josephine immediately stepped between them, placing a reassuring hand on the horse's neck while holding Theodore's gaze. "Breathe out, Your Grace," she instructed, her voice a low, steady murmur. "You carry your authority like a drawn sword. Drop it. He smells the iron in your blood." Theodore exhaled, deliberately relaxing his jaw and his shoulders. He took a slow, measured step forward, extending the back of his hand, just as he had seen her do. Erebus hesitated, then stretched his neck, blowing a warm gust of air over Theodore's knuckles. The Duke felt a profound, unexpected ache in his chest, a sudden realization of how deeply isolated he had been in his own rigid world of command. In that fleeting moment, touching the velvet muzzle of the beast he had almost killed, Theodore realized he was falling unequivocally in love with Josephine Bennet. But the peace of Aylesbury Manor was a fragile illusion. Lord Charles Montague was acutely aware of the Duke's progress. Montague had spies in the local taverns, and the rumors of the Whispering Witch of Aylesbury taming the Spanish demon threatened his guaranteed victory in the upcoming autumn hunt. Desperate to ensure Theodore's public humiliation and secure the contested woodland, Montague bribed a disgruntled undergroom named Thomas O'Rourke to handle the problem. 3 days before the hunt, Josephine decided it was time to test Erebus under the saddle. She refused a traditional bit, opting for a gentle leather hackamore that rested on the bridge of his nose. The morning mist was thick, blanketing the training arena in a damp, grey silence. Theodore was absent, called away to a magistrate's meeting in the village, as Josephine swung gracefully onto the stallion's bare, muscular back. O'Rourke made his move. Hidden behind a dense row of yew hedges bordering the arena, the saboteur waited until Josephine had the horse in a steady, forward trot. Then O'Rourke threw a lit string of imported Chinese firecrackers directly under the stallion's hooves. The explosion was deafening, a rapid-fire staccato of gun-like cracks that shattered the morning quiet. Instinct, forged in the fires of past abuse, seized Erebus. He let out a terrified shriek and bolted. He didn't just run, he launched into a violent, twisting buck, his massive body contorting in midair. Josephine, riding with no stirrups and no bit to control his mouth, was violently unseated. She flew through the air, landing hard against the wooden perimeter fence. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, leaving her gasping in the dirt, her vision blurring. O'Rourke stepped out from the hedges, a cruel smile twisting his face, expecting the maddened beast to trample the girl as he had trampled so many others. But Erebus did not flee. Hearing Josephine's weak gasp, the stallion slammed his front hooves into the dirt, skidding to a halt. He spun around, his eyes wild, his chest heaving with panic. But instead of trampling her, he charged back to where she lay. He planted his massive 18-hand frame directly over her fallen body, positioning himself between Josephine and O'Rourke. Erebus lowered his head, bared his teeth, and pinned his ears flat. He let out a low, guttural roar sound, more lion than equine, and lunged at the saboteur. O'Rourke's smile vanished. He scrambled backward, shrieking in terror as the stallion's iron-shod hooves lashed out, missing the man's skull by mere inches. O'Rourke turned and fled blindly through the hedges, tearing his clothes on the thorns, running for his very life. When Theodore arrived at the stables an hour later, summoned by the panicked shouts of the maids, his heart stopped. He found Josephine sitting on a hay bale, an ugly purple bruise blooming along her cheekbone, while Erebus stood protectively over her, his nose resting gently on her shoulder. "Who did this?" Theodore's voice was a lethal, icy whisper. "Thomas O'Rourke," Josephine managed to say, wincing as she pressed a cold rag to her head. "But it wasn't his fault, Your Grace. He was acting on orders. I saw the crest on the coin purse he dropped when he ran. It bore the Montague seal." Theodore's slate-gray eyes darkened with a fury that made the blood run cold. He didn't shout. He didn't summon the constable. He simply walked over to Josephine, knelt in the dust, and gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs grazing her jawline. "Montague has made a grave miscalculation," Theodore murmured, his gaze locking with hers. "He believes he is fighting a gentleman's wager. He is about to learn that he has waged war against my family." The morning of the autumn hunt dawned crisp and unforgiving. The sprawling estate of Lord Charles Montague overflowed with the elite of British society. Gossiping nobles eagerly awaited the Duke of Aylesbury, whispering about the wagers, massive stakes, the deed to the fertile Blackwood Valley. When Theodore rode into the courtyard, a stunned silence fell over the gathered aristocracy. He was mounted on Erebus. The beast was a terrifying vision of equine perfection, his black coat shimmering like polished onyx. But what shocked the crowd was the complete absence of iron. Theodore rode the supposed monster with nothing but a simple leather hackamore. Josephine stood quietly at the edge of the courtyard. She offered a brief, imperceptible nod. Theodore held her gaze, drawing strength from the woman who had fundamentally altered his soul. Lord Montague trotted forward on his prized grey hunter, his smile venomous. "A brave choice, Fitzroy. Riding a killer with a child's bridle." "My affairs are perfectly managed," Theodore replied calmly. "Let us ride." The master of hounds blew the copper horn, and the hunt surged forward, a thunderous wave of hooves tearing through the autumn countryside. Montague had treacherously designed the route. He bribed the trail layers to drag the fox scent directly toward the deadly eastern boundary of his estate, a jagged limestone ravine known as Dead Man's Drop. It was a terrifying 20-foot chasm with a freezing river below. It was a jump no sane equestrian would attempt, but Montague had stationed the finish line just on the other side. As the hunting party thinned out, unable to keep up, only Theodore and Montague remained, thundering side by side through the dense oak forest. Erebus was magnificent, moving as a flawless extension of Theodore's will. They navigated tight turns with a fluid grace that left Montague violently spurring his exhausted grey just to keep pace. Suddenly the tree line broke. The deafening roar of rushing water filled the air. "Dead Man's Drop," Montague shouted a desperate gleam in his eye. "Forfeit the deed, Fitzroy, or break your neck." Theodore saw the ravine approaching at terrifying speed. The gap was impossibly wide. A lifetime of rigid military logic screamed at him to pull back. But he remembered Josephine's soft voice. "A willing partner will walk through fire for you." Theodore dropped the reins. He grabbed a handful of thick black mane, leaned forward, and gave Erebus absolute freedom. "Show them," Theodore whispered. Erebus didn't break stride. At the edge of the abyss, the mighty stallion coiled his hindquarters and launched into the air. Time suspended. Theodore felt the immense power of the animal carrying him over the yawning gap. They flew before landing with a bone-jarring thud on the solid earth of the opposite side. Erebus scrambled for a fraction of a second before finding his footing, throwing his head up with a victorious whinny. Montague, blinded by rage, refused to forfeit. He drove his spurs deep into his horse's flanks, forcing the exhausted animal toward the edge. "Charles, no!" Theodore roared. The grey hunter balked at the last possible second, his hooves sliding wildly. The horse scrambled backward, but momentum carried Montague over the edge. He screamed as he tumbled into the rocky shallows below. Theodore guided Erebus down a steep deer path. At the bottom, Montague lay half submerged in the freezing water, his leg pinned beneath a waterlogged timber. The current was rising fast. Theodore dismounted into the rapids. He looped his heavy leather lunge line around the submerged log, tossing the end to the bank. "Back up, boy," he shouted. Erebus clamped his teeth onto the leather. He leaned back, digging his hooves into the mud, pulling with locomotive strength until the massive log shifted, allowing Theodore to drag Montague to safety. When the hunting party arrived, they found a legendary scene, the Duke supporting his bitter rival, while the devil horse stood quietly beside them. "You win, Fitzroy," Montague choked out. "The deed is yours." "Keep your land, Charles," Theodore said coldly. "Just ensure this county knows an Aylesbury horse bows to no one, but saves those who cannot save themselves." That evening, Theodore avoided the grand celebrations. He walked to the warmly lit stables, finding Josephine sitting in the straw with Erebus's massive head resting peacefully in her lap. Theodore knelt beside her. "He flew today, Joe," Theodore whispered, "and he saved a man's life." Josephine smiled. "He always had it in him. He just needed someone to ask instead of command." Theodore interlaced his fingers with hers. "You saved him, and you saved me too. Rule this estate with me, Josephine. Let us build a legacy of understanding." She looked at the man who had laid down his weapons, and then at the beast they had healed. "Only if I get to keep the hackamore," she whispered, leaning in to meet his lips. "True strength isn't found in breaking a spirit, but in earning a heart." Josephine and the Duke proved that patience and empathy can tame even the fiercest of beasts and the hardest of men. If you were captivated by this incredible story of trust, resilience, and romance, please hit the like button, share it with fellow history and animal lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable historical tales.